path in our study through the New Testament. We are in the book of 1 Timothy. We make it to chapter 3 today. And before we look at the text, just kind of a reminder what we're looking at here in the text. And I want to make some observations before we get started in this. First of the observations, and it's something that I've been mentioning at every one of the studies, this book, as we look through it, really is going to have it as its primary goal, what it has to give to Timothy in the way of helping him know and understand church structure. What is acceptable for the practice of the church when it meets collectively, and that's what he's been dealing with primarily even thus far. And now he's going to get into what is the leadership. So when you see how he was in the first chapter and 2 chapters, once again, it's how is the church perceived from the outside? Not that it's to put up false pretenses, but that it is to live peaceably in the midst of a world that doesn't share its values. And he's going to repeat that when it comes to the leadership. It's one of the characteristics of leadership is that it's supposed to exist in a world that's hostile towards what we believe. That hasn't changed. You know, we're 2,000 years after the church's beginning, and the long and the short of it is that the world's never going to agree with the values that a church holds if it holds biblical values. So then he gets into what it is to have an orderly church, even when the congregation is meeting together, and the things that would be happening during what we would consider, putting it in modern terms, a church service, if you will. And so, of course, the importance of doctrine, the importance of teaching, all of those things are just incredibly important. Now what he's going to do is get into the qualifications that there are for people who hold different offices of leadership. Now, you're going to find that there are some parallel verses when we get to Titus in the first chapter there, but for what Timothy is being told by Paul, this lays out what should be the qualifications for the person in the church that serves in as the head of ministry. And then secondarily, which we'll get to next week, the people who would serve in ministry as the servants to the rest of the church. Now, I find this fascinating because in our world today, especially when you speak of Catholics and of Orthodox and to some extent Lutherans and the older the denomination, I guess is the best way of putting it, the more you find a kind of a structure of hierarchy within that church, but much more so when it comes to Catholics and even as far as the older Orthodox beliefs. And what I mean by that is if you just step back from it and forgetting the debate about whether or not it's valid, you'll look at the church structure and the hierarchy, and Catholics are probably the most recognizable because you have from the popes down to the cardinals to bishops, bishops to priests, and then to the laity. And so you have a lot of layers of structure. And in those layers of structure, you have very, very specific roles and responsibilities that those particular offices carry with them. The difficulty with that, it's obviously very well structured, and it's been that way for a very, very long time. But the question has to come from those kinds of things that you see. What is the biblical reason behind that? Where do they get their qualifications, first of all, and then secondly, where do they get the how-to, if you will, manual of what they're supposed to do and how do they operate in that particular office? And in the case, especially with the Catholic Church, unlike the priesthood that you had in the Old Testament, again, if you were to say that the Old Testament had a priesthood, and then the answer would be, well, how do we know that? We can start looking back, starting with Leviticus, and then through Numbers and Deuteronomy, a lot of repetition that's there. But we know this: the priesthood was selected by God, and how do we know that? Because of the tribes that were represented. It was the rod of Aaron that budded. And so it was going to be the Levites who would be the priests. God chose that. And then the priests would come out of the Levites. The Levites not all served as priests, but they would serve in some way of ministering in the temple. The actual priesthood came through Aaron's line, and we know that because his staff, his rod, had buds on it, and that was God's way of saying, this is who I've chosen. So the idea of a priesthood is given by God. Who he selected is the very foundation of that. Secondly, what were they supposed to do? What were their responsibilities? What were they supposed to wear? What were they supposed to abstain from? And what were they supposed to do as far as what was acceptable? Where would they live among the community? Would they have an allotment of land? All of those kind of questions are not only asked but answered. And God gave the specific instruction. And it's even not even what it became in time when man started to add his own part to it. If you take just what God had specified, then when it came to the offerings and how would they be offered and who was supposed to do what and how would, the detail of it is minute, and it's, you have the big picture parts of it, again, from the tribe of Levi, the priests being from the generations, the direct descendants of Aaron, and on the rest of it. The amount of detail that we have about that particular priesthood is stunning, and it is incredibly descriptive. There's so much that's there. There's no way to question whether or not there was a priesthood in the Old Testament and who was it that had put it in place. Now, when it comes to a New Testament idea, there are many who believe that there is a priesthood in the New Testament with all of the offices, and they believe that it is as much vital to the function of the church as the Old Testament one was. The problem that you run into with that belief is there is a complete lack of any kind of written instruction for that kind of a priesthood. And so what you would sometimes see people point to is what we're looking at right here. Because you have in this chapter, the third chapter, you have the offices that are mentioned here, and there's one that's also mentioned in Titus, and I'll get to those when we get into the passage itself. But really, you have, for the most part, kind of three offices that are mentioned, and two of the three are used interchangeably when you compare Titus to this. And so, what you find in this, when it mentions the two different people, the what are known as the deacons, that'll be next week, and then this week what we have are known as the bishops. That's really it for the hierarchy that's mentioned in any kind of description. Now again, there are other passages that you can find that kind of speak a little bit more of the people that are functioning in the church, but there's even less information about them. So for something as important as church order, especially since we're looking at the book that has more to do and more to say about church structure and about offices and positions that people would hold. First Timothy has more information kind of chapter for chapter than any place else in the New Testament, and you will find no place in here where he says this person has this responsibility and they have this title and here's what they're supposed to do and when they're supposed to do it and how they're supposed to do it, as you have in the Old Testament. You have nothing like that, not even remotely close to it in the New Testament. So all of that to say, what's your point, Chris? What are you trying to get to? My point is, when we see church structure as we see it currently in our modern day, when we survey much of the church, there is so much that you have in the day-to-day function and the people within the church that really clearly is not in the text. It's not taught in the scripture. There's nothing that tells you, as far as these people, let's just say the bishops and the deacons that are mentioned here in the third chapter, all that you have are their qualifications on the personal side of things. Here are their characteristics, but nothing whatsoever about their function. So that's important. It's not an omission. It's just simply stating that the church is not so rigidly structured that you have all these layers of hierarchy, because ultimately what you end up having is a very much authoritarian kind of church at that point, which is what the priesthood had devolved into. The priesthood in the Old Testament was intended to be this. God wanted fellowship with mankind. Sin was a problem to that. And so the only way that man could be walking rightly before God is for his sin to be covered, and that would keep their fellowship in place. In between God and man, there was this priesthood that would have the function of offerings and keeping people represented before God. And so God gave them that structure. In the New Testament, there's no need for that any longer because Jesus has done all of that, but in a once and for all way that it doesn't have to be repeated as it was with the priesthood. This is precisely what the book of Hebrews talks about at length. So everything that was necessary in the Old Testament sense was never consistent, and it was never able to settle the problem with sin. And this is why Jesus had to come and die as he did, and then resurrect and pay for the sin of mankind, so that the repetition of sacrifice could be put to an end, and we could enter into a rest, having sin being dealt with in Jesus, our high priest, the one who makes intercession for us once and for all, making that sacrifice. So with that, it makes the priesthood of no relevance, of no use to us any longer. Does that mean that there are not still people that God is going to raise up to minister to the church? Of course, or else the church just becomes a free-for-all. There's no order to it. There would be no structure of any kind, and I don't have a problem with structure at all. In fact, before moving here to Texas, I was the senior pastor at the church, those of you who know who I am. And for 10 years, that was my primary role in the church, was to be the senior pastor. And so a Sunday morning would look like most Sunday mornings. We would have a time of worship. We would have a time where we spent in God's Word. And our particular variety of church is we teach all the way through the Scripture, every chapter, every verse of every book, and we do so in its entirety. That never changed. And so the same thing would be in our evening studies as we would go through the Old and the New Testament, what I'm continuing on here now that I'm in Texas. But that was about the extent of it. We had people that were accountable as far as the government is concerned, our board of elders for the business aspect of it, if you will. And then as far as the functioning inside of the church, we had people that were considered as pastors, in this case what would be kind of fall into the category of the bishops. And then the people that would be elders, and those would be the ones who are kind of in the same type of mold as the pastoral, but they're ministering to the people, but they're seen as, we see it sometimes as elders, mentioned as elders. That's what we find in Titus chapter 1. But then we had the people that were the deacons, and they're the ones who would welcome people at the door. And they were the ones who are ushers, and they were the ones who, at our functions, our church functions, would be the ones who would serve. And a deacon was just kind of a servant, very similar to what we see reminiscent in Acts chapter 6. So we get the qualifications and what the titles are, but the function of what they are was very much loose compared to what we have in the Old Testament. Does that mean that it wasn't orderly? Of course not. That's what this whole book is about. So can you have a church that's not so rigid in its hierarchy and yet still have church order? Of course you can. And to me, frankly, the best way to do that is to have as few levels of man institution as possible. And so that's why our church structure looked a whole lot different than many of the older denominations. The older denominations would kind of mock that and say you're just kind of, Johnny come lately, so what do you know about anything? Well, I would just simply go to what the text has to say about the topic, and what we see here, this talks about the highest of the hierarchy, if you want to call it that Paul mentions. So again, would Paul consider himself to be a bishop in this sense? Of course he would. And he says to of Timothy as well, and then Timothy, when you're going to have other people that you'll put in this position of, kind of heading up a church, here are their qualifications. You'll also notice that Paul will refer to himself in other passages as being just one of the elders and one of the servants. So it's kind of an interesting thing where Paul didn't see himself as, I'm over everybody else and everybody answers to me, and then there are those people who are under me. You don't have that, nor does he see that there's anyone above him either. So for those people that believe that there was a really rigid hierarchy in the early church, beginning with Peter as the Pope, Paul doesn't recognize Peter's authority over him in any way, nor do we ever see Peter put in the place of exerting any kind of power over the rest of the church. So again, that's what the church has made of itself, but you can't find a biblical justification for it, very simply put. There's just no way to make that case, especially from what we read here in this third chapter. So let's look at the text, chapter 3. We're going to pick up at verse 1. So let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for the time that we can spend in your word, and we pray that you would open our eyes to what's true and what we can know. And so we give you thanks for your word, and we thank you that it answers these questions and gives us understanding. We give you all thanks and pray that you would prepare our hearts and minds for what we will read and understand. We give you all thanks and praise in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 3, there's a little change in the actual language, and it's because of what's attached to it. But you'll notice that in verse 1 and 2, the word we have in English is bishop. And so there's a little bit of a change because it's where you see, let's just read verse 1. This is a faithful saying. And so he's used that terminology before. This is something that is worthy of acceptance. It's a faithful saying. We should all agree upon this. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. And this, where you see the word position and bishop, where those two things are attached, changes it just a little bit. But it's the Greek word that we get. It's episkope, but it's you'll hear the people that are the Episcopalians will basically, by their very definition, they're talking that they are a bishop-driven or a hierarchy-driven kind of a church. This is just the title of. Now, when you see the same word in verse 1, it's sometimes used as visitation. It's only used 4 times in the entirety of the New Testament. And in this case, where Paul uses it, he uses it a little bit differently than it is in those other occasions. And then the next verse, you see it said at the second time, a bishop. Now, this expands it a little bit. This word, again, it's where we get the word episcopal, but episcope is just a person who is in a place of oversight. And yeah, it would show what we would consider, if we're going to try to make a modern equivalent, is the person that answers on behalf of the church. Who's the leader and we call them modern day pastors. So if you're looking for kind of the modern equivalent, Paul would be in this category. Timothy would be in this category. Titus would be in this category, I would say. And he's telling Timothy, in your function doing what you're doing, if a person desires this, if they want to be in this position, then it's a good thing that they desire to be. But then Paul says, let me give you what their qualifications must be. So you're not going to take just the first warm body that you find, because there are so many reasons why, if they are not characteristically of this type of maturity, spiritually speaking, you're going to begin to create some real problems for yourself. So when there's an interesting thing here where he says, if a person desires this position, and by saying that a person can desire it, I think we find this to be a real problem, and some of the qualifications they genuinely don't meet. And we'll get to that as we go a little bit further. But many people that I see that are in this place, when I watch them on video or I see them on television or I watch them being interviewed or whatever else, I don't think they fully understand the gravity of the title that they hold, because there is almost, I want to be very careful how I say it, but there's almost a pompousness to them. There's almost this idea of entitlement, and there's that celebrity that they end up having, and that really kind of goes against some of the qualifications that are here. A lot of times you'll watch them prancing around stage and you'll say there's really not a lot of humility in that. That doesn't show a great deal of maturity. The world sees it and mocks it. And as far as some in the church that see it, that are a little bit older and not so impressed by the personality and maybe the youthfulness of it, they start to miss the mark of basic qualifications in a number of different ways. But again, their names and their faces don't really matter. They come and go, but the underlying problem still remains. And Paul wants to make sure that none of those kind of things would be taking place in the church. Again, you've heard me say it a number of times. Most of the modern church, if you try to put it back in the first century, in the very hostile elements that there were of the pagan world, but around Jerusalem and Israel, they wouldn't have made it more than a couple of weeks before they would have just left the position out of fear, and they'd have been driven from it, because they shouldn't be in the position to begin with. So with all of that being said, let's remember here, once again, nowhere in this chapter are you going to get anything saying, now a bishop is supposed to do this, and he's supposed to do that. These are his responsibilities, and this is what he's supposed to do week in and week out, year in, year out, month by month. You're not going to see any of that anywhere in the New Testament. It just does not exist. So if for those people who think that God has a very highly structured, highly organized hierarchy, you have to take the church's word for that, because you can't find any biblical justification for it. And that is, to me, a big, big deal. So, bishops. This would be, again, if we're trying to picture in our minds, it would be like Timothy when Paul says, I have left you there. Basically, you are the person that is in charge. That office is something similar, and what we're thinking of in terms of being a bishop. And then look at the qualifications, because they're pretty stunning. A bishop, then, he must be blameless. Now, again, bishop, it comes from episcopus, episcope rather. When it comes to what we see in Titus, in fact, let's turn to Titus very, very quickly, just the first chapter. In verse 5, you get, let's just read it, verse 5. For this reason I left you in Crete. Now, this is Paul writing to Titus. Sounds very similar to what he ended up saying to Timothy, when I left you in Ephesus. Well, here he says, when I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders. And that word elders there is where we get Presbyterian. It's the presbytus. And so it is the elders, but notice when you get down to verse 7, for a bishop must be. So he uses this presbyter, which is an overseer. It's a, I guess elder sometime is the way that it's also translated. Notice by the time that you get to verse 7, he's talking about these same people in the same context. Verse 6 tells you that he has to be blameless, a husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination, similar to the qualifications that Timothy gives. He says, because, and here's why, because a bishop must be blameless. It's that same word that we have here of episcope. Now, what you're going to notice next week, as we get to the second of these two groups that are mentioned here in 1 Timothy 3, that's where you're going to get the word deacons or diakonos in the Greek. So, back to 1 Timothy 3, this bishop has to be blameless. And by being blameless, it means that when they're examined, you don't find fault in them. Now, are they perfect? Of course not. But nobody's going to be able to bring an accusation against that person, especially from within the church, if you're going to say, we're making, brother so-and-so a bishop, or in this case, the episcope, the overseer, the elder, whatever you're going to want to say. That person needs to be above reproach, where somebody wouldn't go, wait a minute, you can't have that guy do that. Do you know about him? That's the idea of blameless. Now, accusations can be made of people all the time. That's not the issue. It's whether or not there's any merit to the accusations. So a person would have to be able to withstand any kind of scrutiny that would come against him, and any kind of accusation that could be made. It would have to be shown to be a false accusation, thus making the person blameless. Again, there's a big difference between blameless and sinless. Nobody is going to be called sinless, but they can be called blameless. Right here's one of those examples of that. So blameless, they're be above reproach. They're not going to be able to have somebody make accusation and then have it be found out. And then it says also has to be a husband of one wife. Now, there are two groups or two different views of what this means. Does it mean that he's not a polygamist? That he's, because that could be seen as being a potential. Again, this is really not even in the Jewish world necessarily. He's talking to a bunch of people in Ephesus, and so it's more in the Gentile part of the world. I don't find a lot of merit to this being the polygamy part of it. I think this deals more with, because it's in line with what Jesus taught, is that there's no reason for a man to have had multiple wives. And the only provisions that are ever given for a man being married and then unmarried and then married again is if there has been adultery, and that in that case would have had to have been committed by his wife, and or she has died and he's able to then remarry. Same thing with women, they have the same responsibilities to stay faithful to their oath of marriage. And the only two provisions is if their spouse becomes unfaithful and breaks the marriage covenant, the person who has not breached that covenant is free to do as they wish. They can remarry, they can divorce their husband or wife, the offending party, but they're free to reconcile as well. But in the case of death, and again, they're free to remarry after death, or they can stay single for the rest of their lives. It's an optional thing in both cases. So that's what Jesus taught. That's why it would seem to me, again, that in this case, speaking of bishops, that they would be people who have shown a fidelity to their marriage responsibilities. So they've only been married to one wife. Now, again, if that question came up and something had happened to this bishop's first wife and she had died or had been unfaithful and then he had remarried, he's not in violation of any kind of church discipline when it comes to that matter, because Jesus addressed it and Paul addresses it in other places as well. So there really wouldn't be any controversy here. But if somebody would look at him and say, that guy's been married and divorced for all kinds of different reasons, that puts him in that place. And once again, it's that, how is that person above reproach? They're not blameless at that point because they're acting unbiblically. Now, you'll have a lot of people who will say, yeah, but there were other extenuating circumstances. Okay, you can debate those things, but looking at what we're looking at here, he makes this part very, very plain. Now, if a church had somebody that they were thinking of putting into that position, they can look at those extra circumstances and come to a biblical resolution. Let's just stick with what this says right here and right now. So he goes on from that. He says, this husband of one wife, he must also then be temperate. And this is kind of self-controlled, vigilant. A person that's not given to, fits of one thing or the other, but temperate. They're just not thrown to fits and extremes in one direction or the other. Also, they must be sober-minded. So this goes to the same thing. It goes to sobriety of action, but also to sobriety of mind in this case. So a temperate person, you're going to say there's a sobriety to them. Once again, they're never out of control. And, again, sobriety can mean in the literal sense, not drunk, but it can also mean that if there's a sobriety, it means that there's a kind of a demeanor to them, that they're not out of control. So a temperate person, as we just saw, is one who outwardly demonstrates temperance and self-control and restraint. Now also, there is also this, it has to be a matter of the mind, because the mind is going to control the action unless you're really good about pretense. So some people are good about putting up a face, but going on inside is real turmoil. Now, if a bishop is going to be in this place, again, because they're having to lead the church, outwardly, there has to be temperance. Inwardly, or self-control or sobriety of their actions, but there also has to be a sobriety of mind, because they can put up the pretense for a while, but sooner or later that's going to crack. Something is going to come to the surface because the mind is not settled. So Paul deals with both ends of this, that as far as their mind is concerned, it's settled, it's sober, it's disciplined, it's controlled. Therefore, their actions show that, not by pretense, but by just common action, because one is predicated on the other. When I think of what Jesus said, that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So you can get people that will govern their tongue, but inside, if there's all kinds of turmoil, sooner or later that spills over. Same thing here. When it comes to temperance, when it comes to self-control and sobriety, on the outward, it also needs to be done on the inward. So he goes on to say from that point, he says temperate and then sober-minded, and then of good behavior, which just seems, it just means orderly and modest. Once again, these are very similar characteristics. So he's just kind of going through a list of qualities, qualifications, just characteristics of the people that are supposed to be, in this position. Now let's remember, and I'd like to try to point this out every time we run into a list where you have a list of things. Let's remember that it's not necessarily, never is a list completely comprehensive and it covers every particular detail, because that's not the intent. The intent is to say, these are supposed to be people of impeccable character. And if the question would be, well, Paul, because he could have just said that, whoever your bishops are, they have to be of impeccable character. But of course, the typical human is going to say, well, give me some examples. What do you mean? How do we know what impeccable character is? Okay, well, how about blameless? How about self-controlled? How about the husband of one wife? How about a sobriety of mind? How about good behavior? There's a modesty to them. They're moral people. They are ethical people. There's just nothing that you can say against them. That's what prompts a list like this, though you could probably throw in a whole bunch of other characteristics. So again, it's not some comprehensive list, and we need to remember that so that we don't get stuck in saying, well, I've ticked all these boxes, so that must mean me. Well, are there any boxes that are not even listed here? So it's intended rather to take a look at it as the big picture and not just, man, once I can check that final box, I'm going to be that guy. So again, I genuinely believe this. When it comes to the matter, I don't care if it's bishops, I don't care if it's elders, I don't care if it's just people that are serving tables, what we would consider as the servants, or what we're going to look at next week is what we know as the deacons. Any of those things, I believe that it's an admirable thing if a person says, I want to be used by God, praise the Lord, I'm glad for that. But if they say, I want to be used by the Lord in this way, well, there's probably a good indication at that point that you're really kind of forcing the issue, and God may not have you in that position. I can definitely tell you this. Maybe if you've been around for me for any length of time and heard me teach on these things, the idea of being a senior pastor or even doing what I'm doing online now was not something that I had aspired to in my earlier years. And the day that I became the senior pastor at Cypress back in 2010, it was not something that I said, I'm going to do this eventually. I'll pay my dues. I'll put in my time, and eventually it'll fall into my lap and I'll be that guy. Or I'll go start a church somewhere. There's never anything that I wanted to do. I was more than happy to fill that role when God put it there to me, but really he had to pull me to it. I wasn't going to grab it to myself because I'd watched what my pastor went through. And I think genuinely, if somebody really understands the gravity of what it is that they're going to be partaking in, it should give them pause to recognize, man, I will have to give account for everything that I say. That is no small matter. And I can honestly say this, after all these years of doing this, that still is something that's in the back of my mind, is that I'll have to answer for the things that I have said, and whether or not I have misrepresented or I have presented him correctly. That's a big, big deal. And I don't care what you do in your service to him. That really goes for all of us. We do answer even for those idle words. So really, really important that we recognize this. So men of impeccable character is what we're getting to. Of good behavior, once again, good behavior, just it's modest. There's an order to them. They're orderly people. And it's going to not only be just them, but you're going to see it really translates into the rest of their house. This idea of hospitable, it's just, they're inviting people who are willing to engage and to entertain and to see to the well-being of guests into their home, into the fellowship, wherever it may be. But these are people who are engaging, and we know them. As soon as you say these kind of characteristics, there are probably a lot of people that come to mind. I get to a conference every year, twice a year, up in Appleton, Wisconsin, and my friend Dwight Doval, the pastor there, and the leadership at Calvary Chapel of Appleton, they have the most amazing group of people within their church who are so good at hospitality. They're so good at welcoming people in, and there are so many of them that serve. And when I get there, I'm usually one of the last people to leave at the end of each of the evenings. And there are those people that once everybody clears out of the sanctuary, man, they've got the vacuum cleaners, and they're going through and they're doing all kinds of things that make people feel very welcomed. Everything is orderly, and it's from the top down. It's from Dwight to the elders, the deacons, the servants, all of those people. They just, as one, they operate as one person, and their way of bringing people into the church and making them feel welcomed and taking care of needs, it is a pretty impressive thing to watch, and they do it consistently. And I always love to point it out when I'm there. I'm always awestruck after all those years of going to those conferences. There's nothing quite like it. Back home in my church, that I still consider myself to be a part of that church in Cypress. I still serve as one of the pastors on staff, though not salaried. I still consider that to be my home church, though we attend Calvary Chapel of Weatherford here. In the church back in California, Again, there are some people, when we put on various things for the church, or when we put on a conference or those kind of things, there were always those same people. You could depend on them. They would be the ones who would be there early. They would go home late. They would be the ones taking care of the needs of the people and of the tables and all the rest of it. Again, Acts chapter 6 kind of stuff, that people were selected for that very same reason. And when you read what it says in verse or in chapter 6 there of Acts, it talks about their qualifications, that they would have to be people of good reputation who were filled with the Spirit, and they had these basic qualifications. They were filled with wisdom as well, was one of the other qualifications. And they were from among the people. You didn't go out and hire them. They were from within the body. And so these were people who have good report. Nobody's going to roll their eyes and go, why is that person serving? A lot of the same kinds of characteristics here. And so, it's always wonderful to be able to point out when you have people who very, very specifically meet the kind of criteria that's being spoken of. I love to be able to acknowledge them. They don't lose their reward. It's not exalting the people. It's just saying, these are people who are obedient to the calling that God has put upon their life, and I acknowledge such. So, with that being said, in at the end of verse 3, it also mentions being able to teach, and it's kind of the family of the words where we get didaskalia, didaskalos, and the different variations of that, which is those things which are taught. It's the verbal communication of what is being taught. Now again, what needs to be taught in a church is really doctrine. Doctrine's the issue. And so we know that from what we're going to see in 2 Timothy when we get there, that the Word of God was given for, first of all, doctrine, the things that we would teach. And so a person that is in this position as a bishop, one who is going to be the overseer of a church, these are people who need to be able to instruct others. Important part of that. They themselves had better be familiar with what they're talking about, in this case, biblical things. But if their topic, or if they're, as we like to do, we're reading through a particular text, we have to be familiar with it so that we're not like the ones that are maybe new to the faith. There was a time, certainly, even just with this Bible study that we're doing right here, I never could have taught this Bible study because I didn't have any kind of a real genuine knowledge of the topic and of the language, of the books, of all of that. It just comes with time. Again, I'm in my, 36th, 37th year, something like that, of being a believer. So the idea that we're going to grow as time goes by, and we will amass to ourselves knowledge and things that God will show us, and they become useful in time, well, that just comes again with time and seasoning, which you get the impression from this. He's going to mention about not being novices and stuff like that. It's that very same type of thing. There's an age to them. And here's one thing I can tell you as well. There wasn't always a time where I could have said, yeah, I've been there, done that. I've seen that take place in a church before. I've been through those things. I've seen that happen to this person, that person, or myself. We tend to amass a reservoir of knowledge and things that we've seen experientially. We've watched it take place around us, and it's not like our first time around the block, right? That happens with time, and I'm glad that sometimes it's not all that pleasant to have to go through them, but once you've been through them, you learn a lot of things along the way. Same thing with why we believe what we believe. If you immerse yourself in the Word of God, you tend to grow in your understanding of it because you expose yourself to it again and again and again and again, and God will instruct you enough to where you remember those things and you've committed them to understanding and memory, and God can use those things. So a person has to be able to teach. So able to teach just means skillful. There's a mastery, if you will, or a thorough understanding of what it is that you are discussing and what you are teaching. So in verse 3 says that you are not given to wine. And this is one of those things that really, really divides so many people. So let's take a look at the first part of it and then the second part of it. Because again, this is, of all the topics you can touch on in the scripture, this is one of the most divisive, I guess you could say. And so here's what we know from this particular passage. It means that this is not something, almost the literal translation is you're not lingering over it. It's not something, it's not your go-to. And so when it comes to even the matter of exposure to alcoholic things, it's not your go-to, and once there, you don't stay at it. The Bible does not anywhere, it doesn't condemn the consumption of alcohol. There's all the debates about the strength of the alcohol and how much of it you could consume without becoming drunk. We know it was certainly possible to be drunk. There's no question about that. We get that from Acts chapter 2. When the men speaking in tongues, the people said, they've just been drinking. So clearly they understood about being inebriated and being drunken. So that's not what's being spoken of here. It's just, is that your go-to? And if you're exposed to it, do you linger at it? Do you stay with it? So not given to that kind of partaking. Now, there are people who will say, somebody say in my position, do you find that you're able to drink? Here's the funny thing about it. I could probably argue either side of that. And people are going to be pretty firm in what it is that they actually believe. We also know this as far as cultures are concerned. I know that it's a much different thing that doesn't have quite the taboo in mainly parts, especially parts of Europe, that it might have here in the States. And there is some sensitivity that we should have towards that. So for myself, I would look at that, and if somebody was going to make the case, I would have to say there's nowhere where the Bible condemns a person having a drink of wine, because here Paul talks about that, or beer, or whatever it is that's your chosen thing. But it always does, absolutely without any exception, the Bible always speaks against or outright condemns drunkenness. And so here's the problem. We don't have a definition of where is that. Where do we step off from it being something casual to falling into drunkenness? You don't blow a breathalyzer test, and the Bible gives you the limits of what is and what is not, and how do you cross over into that. But when I stepped away from that myself years and years ago, drinking was something that I did casually and recreationally before I was saved. It was just part of what we did. And leaving from that was something that didn't happen immediately. But the more that I started to serve in ministry, the less that I realized it was necessary to me, or that I even found enjoyment in it. And I know that I could sometimes take it to excesses when I did it, but then when I was able to step away from it entirely, I'm able to look back on it and say, I don't lack anything having it not be there any longer. And especially with the culture the way that it is here, it can sometimes become a little bit contentious. So since I don't have any desire for it, it's not necessary to me, and it adds nothing to me, I can also abstain from it in its entirety, so that I'll never have to have somebody go, well, wait a minute, you say one thing, but you do this. And this person over here says that you shouldn't, but you say that you should because you do. I can avoid that altogether. And I could say there's people that say you can, there's people that say that you can't. I personally don't. And if I need to counsel with someone who struggles with those things, I don't have to say, well, yeah, I do them too, but you just do them to a different degree and an extent. I have no conflict in that. So I don't look down my nose at people who do. I don't also just want to promote only those people who abstain. For me personally, I can say I am not given to wine. I am not given to any kind of alcohol for a couple of reasons. One, it leaves me totally open to be able to counsel if somebody struggles with it. But secondly, it adds nothing to me. I don't feel like there's anything lacking and missing in my life if I don't partake, and I don't, and I haven't for I don't know how long. It's years and years and years and years. I don't remember how long. So that's just how we can approach this. Once again, if in the church, let's just stay with what Paul's saying here, not making it a modern application. Paul is saying if you're going to be putting people in this position, don't have them conduct themselves like everyone else would when it comes to this matter of drinking. And so not given to those things. And the reason is, it goes again to the idea of reproach, and you can't bring an accusation against them. And yeah, he plays all holy on Sunday mornings, but he's out in the bars, Saturday night and Monday night. That's really what's being said here. So then in verse 3, we get to this. Also, not violent. And so violent really doesn't, it's not the type that'll just, start throwing punches and all the rest of it. Again, these are somewhat already covered. If you're already temperate and self-controlled and you're sober of mind and you can't have a reproach brought against you, you're not going to be one who gets into fights. Interestingly enough, this one follows right on after the drinking part of it, because I do know this from my past and from other people. The more that a person may drink and lose that bit of self-control edge that they have, I watched more of my friends get in fights because they had been drinking than when they were sober. So interesting that that's there. Well, anyhow, we move on to this. Not greedy for money. So this has a couple of different ways. Once they're already in the position, that they don't see it as a means to an end, or they don't find it as a way to try to extort from someone. We can even go back further than that. You shouldn't try to get into the position because you do desire to do it because you know that there is potentially a lucrative outcome to it. And again, there are many people that do that. This idea of, man, I'm going to make it a vocation. And if the church is big enough, I can live pretty comfortably and live extravagantly. We see that there's an entire part of the church that celebrates that kind of thing, that the pastors live on total excess because that's part of their message. If you've got the formula right, God's going to bless you and give you all kinds of money and material things in this world. So the more that they have, the more it makes it sound like it's viable. And then people start to want those exact same things. And there's a real disaster that comes with that, especially in our world today. Think about that. The people who think that all kinds of financial success is a definite way of showing also that they are spiritually successful. How about the people that are just starting to maybe move into that, and then a time like what we have now with incredible inflation and all the difficulties that we had with COVID, how quickly that comes crashing down. So again, if something is a biblical truth, it's going to transcend times and circumstances. Nothing will be able to bring it to its knees. And yet, boy, a lot of people in the prosperity gospel felt a whole lot more prosperous 3 years ago than they do currently. So anyway, says this, they are not greedy for money, and also that they are gentle. And so again, this goes different from quarrelsome, or from the people that want to get into a fight. But if they're gentle, there's a passive kind of way to them. They're not doormats, but they're also at the same place, that they're not in the place of constantly in argument and quarreling. Also, which is said here, they're not quarrelsome. They're not looking to pick fights. And then they're also not covetous. So they don't see what someone else has and then desire it for themselves, especially if they're in the position to try to get that. So these are all, once again, important qualifications that there are in the condition of the people in this position as bishop. These would be the things about them on the character level that are I keep using the word characteristic because I just don't have a better description for it. Verse 4. It is a person, this bishop, has to be one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. And so that's the family is in order, actually the whole household. And so from the children to the marriage relationship to everything about the house, is there a lot of upheaval? Is there a lot of turmoil going on in the house, either between the husband and the wife, the husband and the kids, the wife and the kids? Are the kids into all kinds of things? Because remember, this is a person who has to be able to stand above reproach, blameless. So one of these cases, if somebody was to be put in this position and somebody said, yeah, the problem is wife's not even a believer, and his kids are into drugs, or they're into this, that, or the other thing. There's all kinds of these disqualifying characteristics. And he's going to give his reasons why this is an important matter. So a person in this place, you would want to say, what are the kids like? What's the marriage like? What's the home life like? What are all those things? How do they operate in this person's life? Well, if it's orderly, the marriage is exactly like it's supposed to be. Husband loves the wife, wife loves the husband. There is an order in the house. There's not the warring for different positions. The kids are recognize who the mother and the father are. They pay them their due respect. And they themselves are also in order. They're not going to bring any kind of a reproach against the family. And, that's a pretty important matter. And here's why Paul mentions it, because notice what it says. One who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence, for if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? So this again helps us to understand the gravity of the position, because some people might want to make it less than what it is. But if Paul is saying, how is this person going to be able to lead a church if he can't lead his own household? That gives you an idea of the elevation of the position. In the household, as far as in the godly sense, the husband, the father, would be the head of the house, and everything that goes on in that house is going to reflect on him. And so that tells you a little bit about how he does his job as well. If there's all kinds of rebellion with his kids, maybe he's not doing things in the house like he's supposed to. If there is strife between he and his spouse, once again, there's a problem in the home if that's the case. It's a good indication. So if those things are going on, how can you have him lead a church when he can't even lead his own house? So again, qualifications, characteristics. So verse 6 says this, now he cannot be a novice. So somebody, this is easiest for us to understand, is kind of like new to the faith. And why would that be? Well, because they don't have any idea of what the position necessarily is. They haven't seen it by demonstration, or at least not long enough. They're not sure how things are supposed to work. They don't have the ability to say, well, how do you handle this situation? How do you handle that situation? If this rises up, what do you do? If that happens, how do you approach it? They don't have anywhere near the kind of experience that you can gain. And let me make sure I say this too. Just because you've gained experience doesn't mean that you've gained wisdom. It doesn't mean that you're going to apply the correct lesson that you should have learned by what you went through. But a novice may very well do exactly that. They've been there, done that, but they can't seem to get their minds around what should they do when it happens. And they don't conduct themselves in a way that's becoming. So, as he says here, novice. If a person is, I love this, a person that is really zealous for the things of the Lord and they're really serving him like crazy, but they're maybe a year or two old in the Lord, I am so pleased with them. Give them guidance, give them direction, let them do things in serving various things here or there, but you don't put them into the hierarchy of the ministry because you don't know how they're going to handle next year. They've only got a couple of years in this whole thing. They've not seen it all. So, not somebody that's a novice, not new to it. And here's the reason why. Well, lest being puffed up with pride, they would fall into the same condemnation as the devil did. And so his thing would be pride, wanting to put himself into a place that he does not belong. And that happens because of pride. I will be like the Most High is what the pride of the devil said. So, as you put these pieces together, Paul says, don't grab somebody that's just brand new to it, because you put a person who doesn't really understand the whole thing and you put them into a place of leadership and responsibility, man, they're going to start to say, look at me, I'm so young. And full disclosure, there were times early in my life as a believer, serving at Cyprus, where I was still pretty young in the Lord, but had some responsibility. And yeah, there were some times where you would basically be able to say, man, I'm only this old in the Lord, and look at what he's doing with me. It can become a real problem. And so the idea of becoming prideful and looking at your position, rather than realize if you're there because God's put you there, that's the only reason that you're there, and it's nothing about you. It didn't take me long to learn that. So you want to be able to be sure that yours is a position where you say, it's given to me by God. I don't take credit for anything that is going on with me. Very, very important that we recognize that. So as we start to close this, notice this, what it says. A person who's not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he falls into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, and so in addition to that, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside. Outside of what? Well, outside of the church, clearly. So you might have a good reputation inside the church, but there may be people outside that are not part of it. Family, friends, whatever else it may be, who would look at you and go, yeah, the church, he's got those people fooled, but man, we know the real guy. Now, there are those times that you'll have somebody say, I know what that guy was like in high school, or I know what he was like years ago. Different story, because I want to make sure that we are able to say, and I'm a good example of this, what I was like before I was saved is nothing like what I am now. The things that used to be acceptable to me are not acceptable to me anymore, because God's changed my priorities, and he's shown me the things that are important to him are now then important to me. So I have made his priorities my priorities. That's how it is supposed to work. So again, this is that idea of making sure that you are blameless. If people outside might have a problem with you, if that is ever explored, they would be found out to be the ones who are in error, not you. But here is one of those things. You want to make sure that when the world outside sees you, it doesn't mean that they're going to agree with you, but it does mean that they can't bring some kind of an accusation against you that would stick. It wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. So you have to have a good reputation with those people that are outside. I'm not always picking fights with those people in the world, not always looking to try to get into an argument with government and government people, although we will stand our ground when the things that we believe are being infringed. So there's a balance between those things, but we understand the reason for it. So also, it's said this way, moreover, that he would have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into the reproach and the snare of the devil. So if what he does outwardly is something that really kind of argues against what he does inside the church, then he makes himself really, really susceptible to more trouble from the outside. The devil's going to exploit those things once he's out there and probably find a way to add to the problems that when it all gets found out, it becomes just a real disaster for that person, because everything that they had lived and everything that they had said is completely argued against when it is measured against reality. And that's the point that's being driven here. So again, when we look at this in its totality, it's not a comprehensive list. It's not the only list of qualifications. It's best that we might look at it like this. If Paul was saying, I want these people to be of impeccable character, great. Do you have some examples? Well, yeah, here's some characteristics. These are good ones to know. And he sets the bar incredibly high. This is one of the things I've said to people over the years. When it comes to people, especially if they have to ask it this way, well, what can I get away with? That's a problem. What things can I do? The Bible tells me the things I can't, but what can I do? That pretty much just tells you you're talking with a person who's genuinely a novice, among other things. So here's what I think, if I was to give any kind of counsel or whatever to somebody who's young in the faith. If you're wondering, what should I do and how should I conduct myself? I would love to point them to a passage like this and say, if this is the criteria and these are the qualifications that Paul gives, among many, of the kind of the peak of the leadership in a church, and what it is to have kind of an impeccable character across the board by all kinds of measures, if that's the standard for a leader, why wouldn't anybody from the brand new believer on up want to aspire to those same things? Because these are pleasing to God. So as you're listening to this, you might think, well, I'm a guy, but I don't think I'll ever get to the point where I'm in that role of leadership. Or if you're a woman and saying that office is not even open to me. The idea of having this impeccable character certainly is, because women certainly have a role in the church. There's no doubt about it. In fact, we looked at that last week where it says that women are not to be pastors. Usually we'll get the excuse, well, there were prophetesses in the scripture. Yeah, and that's fine, but that's not leading a church. Those are people that God used to speak at the time, but we're comparing apples and oranges here. But again, to any believer, I don't care where you are in your walk, from the beginning to the end of it, man or woman, here are some really, really good guidelines and what it should look like for the top tier, if you will, of church leadership. And these are things to which we should all aspire. Now, next week, we're going to get to the idea of deacons and their function in the church. It's a step under what a bishop would be as an overseer / elder. That's what's used in Titus. But it is nonetheless, look at the same impeccable character, because he says likewise. And I can tell you from myself that there went from a time where I was doing the work of a deacon, to that time where, as time went by and opportunity was put before me before the Lord, and some years had passed, that he moved me from doing just primarily deacon kind of work, that he moved me into elder bishop kind of work. But that doesn't mean that the bishop can't also be doing the work of a servant, because again, as I had mentioned, Paul does precisely that. So we'll pick up at chapter 3, verse 8 next week in the next of these qualifications, and start moving our way through the rest of the book. So with that being said, I'm sure that there are plenty of things that I may have said today that you would like to have more clarification. Maybe even some would like to argue some of the points. You're free to do so. We'll just see how far that it goes. But if you're looking to argue, I don't argue these things much anymore. If you'd like clarification on anything that I have said, though, clearly I want to make sure that gets communicated. You can contact me through the ministry website, and that is oldpaththeology.net. And we will pick up at chapter 3, verse 8 next week. And please do read ahead. Check out what else is there and become familiar with the text, and then we'll study through it together.